Hello, this is Shinobu Kitema. I'm this year's APS president. It's my great honor and pleasure to give this year's James McKeen Cattell Award to Saul Kassin. Professor Kassin is distinguished professor of psychology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York and Massachusetts professor of emeritus at William College. Professor Kassin pioneered the scientific study of false confessions. Also, he had studied the consequences of confession. His work on forensic confirmation bias is particularly well known. Altogether, he has had a big impact on policy and reform of the criminal justice system. So, big congratulations, Saul.
First, I want to thank APS President Shinobu Kitayama, whose work I have long admired in this field. And I'd like to talk a little bit about false confessions. And the title I give to my talk is Journey from the Social Psych Lab to the Innocence Project's Exonerees. I want to start by describing kind of midway through my career, a September morning that I had in 2002. I was preparing for a new semester of psych classes at Williams College and the phone rang. Hi, Professor Kassin. I'm a producer at ABC News. We're working on a story about an old case and wonder if you'd be willing to look at some videotaped confessions for us. Naturally, I asked, well, what's the case? I can't tell you, she said. Okay, I was scrambling, transitioned from summer to fall, and I explained to her that I really had no time to make a blank check commitment. What was the case? Pushing back, she said they were working on an exclusive story, an exclusive interview. They had a highly visible crime. Would I be able to do this? Can I keep it confidential? I said, sure. What's the case? She paused, the kind of pause that I'm not always sure how to interpret. And then she said, it's the Central Park jogger. I think the people in my life will tell you that I am seldom rendered speechless, but I have to admit, I stopped in my tracks. This was one of those times. I just kept hearing this echo in my head, Central Park jogger. Everyone knows something about this case. In 1989, a 28-year-old investment banker was attacked while jogging. She was violently beaten, she was raped, she was left for dead. When she emerged from her coma a week later, she had no memory for what happened. The local papers were ablaze with headlines like Nightmare in Central Park. In all of the uproar, NYPD solved the crime. The detectives said they solved the crime, or so it seemed. Within 72 hours, they had announced that 5 teenagers, 14, 15, and 16 years old, of Black and Hispanic descent, had confessed. Each boy implicated himself, each boy implicated the others. Their stories were detailed. 4 of the confessions were on videotape for everybody to see. Case closed. The boys recanted their confessions right away, but it was too late. Even though there was no other evidence against them except for those confessions, you can see the 5 kids here: Yusuf Salam, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Corey Wise, and Antron McCrae were tried, convicted, and sent to prison. Being a native New Yorker and a social psychologist, and with peculiar interest in confessions, I followed this case pretty closely at the time. It gnawed at me. There was clearly something wrong. Then again, I had to admit, this was not some lone admission of guilt in some back alley of some small town in the middle of nowhere when nobody was watching. These were 5 confessions, 4 on videotaped. They were detailed, right smack in the middle of Manhattan, and the whole world was watching. That's who I was when ABC News called. And after I regained my mental footing, all I could say was, the Central Park jogger case, what about it? Well, what happened in 2002, 13 years later, and no one saw coming, is that a guy by the name of Mateus Reyes, an imprisoned serial rapist, contacted the DA's office out of the blue and said he was the Central Park jogger rapist and he had acted alone. True to his word, the DNA from the rape kit that had been collected 13 years earlier was a match. The DNA in the rape kit was his. I agreed to appear as an analyst on ABC News, but I told them one condition: I need to see the entire case file, not just the confessions. The boxes came, they arrived, I put everything else down, and when I was done, there was no doubt in my mind. These 5 boys, now men, were innocent. The confessions were false. The story aired later that month, but the city's newspapers, as engaged in the story as they were in 1989, they seemed reluctant to embrace a wrongful conviction narrative. Considering all the attention the crime got in 1989, the spotlight seemed awfully dim on the story now, and I had no idea what the DA would do. I did something I never had done before at that point. In November, I published an op-ed article in the New York Times called False Confessions in the Jogger Case. It's the first time I had publicly inserted myself into a case like that. In December, the Manhattan DA overturned the convictions, and over objections from NYPD, the Central Park Five were exonerated. Again, the story of their exoneration was met with surprisingly little fanfare. 10 years later, and you can see in the bottom center of this slide, Sarah and Ken Burns released an award-winning documentary on the case, which changed the conversation. It's called The Central Park Five. And shortly after this movie came out, the city agreed to compensate the exonerees for $40 million. That changed the conversation. Then more recently in 2019, Netflix released Ava DuVernay's powerful docudrama When They See Us, which brought the story to yet a whole new population. This case is of historic significance. The exonerated 5 have become spokespersons for criminal justice reform, but the most important part of the story is to know that this fantastical incident is not a one-time only affair. It happens all the time. And with that, I'd like to move towards slide 3. And let me step back again for a moment. I come out of graduate school in 1978. I took a postdoc at the University of Kansas to work with Lawrence Reitzman. He had funding for research on juries, an eminent social psychologist. He was a hero of mine. What a stroke of luck. I could not imagine a more interesting venue to study social perception, which was my interest. Within weeks, 2 experiences in tandem sparked my interest and concern. First, I was auditing a course on evidence at KU's law school so I could learn something about the background in law, and I came across a footnote in the assigned casebook, and it cited a book called Criminal Interrogations and Confessions. It was the leading how-to manual published in 1962 on how to interrogate. I borrowed the book from the library, read it cover to cover. The social psychologist in me was horrified. This was like Milgram's obedience experiments, but a whole lot worse. I couldn't help but wonder what effects these tactics would have on innocent people. At the same time, I was having a second experience. We were early in data collection, running mock jury studies, trying to determine what the base rate conviction rates would be for different types of trials. And I couldn't help but notice that every time we had a trial, a mock trial, a transcript, or a video with a confession in evidence, everybody voted guilty. Confessions seemed to be near perfect evidence. Well, that was the second experience. It was clear, as attribution theorist Fritz Heider would have predicted, people instinctually trust confessions, statements against self-interest, sometimes to the point where nothing else matters. From Milgram on the one hand to Heider on the other, we had a problem. And the problem was twofold. The twin pillars of this problem were, first, people can be induced to confess to crimes they didn't commit by interrogators. 2, the rest of the world will believe those false confessions. They will underappreciate the role of the situational forces. Well, interested, Larry and I started to comb through the pages of history. There was no science to turn to. And this is what we found. When you go back over the pages of history, we found that, first of all, false confessions have always happened. This is not a new post-DNA phenomenon. They have always occurred throughout history. It's universal. Innocent people confess not only to police, but you can find instances in the military, in school settings, and in work settings. In fact, here's something people don't realize. In the first ever documented wrongful conviction in the United States, Happened in Vermont, not far from Williamstown, where I live. Brothers Jesse and Stephen Bourne confessed, this is in 1819, to killing their sister's husband. They were both convicted, incarcerated, and sentenced to death, awaiting execution when that husband turned up alive in New Jersey. There is a long history of false confessions. So now let me turn to the next question and the next slide. And that is the question of, why do innocent people confess? Starting in the 1990s, a body of research had erupted. Some of it focused on youth, cognitive abilities, mental health, and other personal vulnerabilities. Question being, what makes an individual susceptible to giving a false confession? Other research, more social and cognitive in nature, focused on the Milgram-esque interrogation tactics that are lawful in this country that can cause innocent people to confess. This research has confirmed the danger of an approach to interrogation that is by definition guilt presumptive. It is a guilt presumptive process aimed at producing a confession. Well, we started in the lab to examine some of these interrogation tactics. In 1991, my undergraduate student, Carlin McNall, and I found that when police suggest minimization themes that offer the suspect moral justification and face-saving excuses, they feign sympathy and understanding and say, you know, I think maybe you were provoked, or you were pressured into it, or you just had too much to drink. People hear that and they infer leniency as if a promise of leniency had been made. Now, it is unlawful for interrogators to promise leniency or immunity from prosecution, but they deliver the same message under the radar, leading people to infer leniency by pragmatic implication. So that was the first of our forays into the experimental literature. Then in 1996, another student, Lee Keachel, and I published what is known as the computer crash paradigm in psych science. This was the first ever ethical procedure for eliciting false confessions. We found in the lab that we could substantially increase the number of innocent college students who would agree to confess to crashing the lab computer by confronting them with false evidence of their guilt. In fact, a subsample of those participants went on to internalize the belief in their own culpability. And that's a whole other conversation. But the fact is that many innocent people, not only through interrogation do they agree as an act of compliance to confess, they actually come to think they committed the crime they did not commit. Soon, other researchers had taken on that paradigm and replicated and extended the results. Even more importantly, what we now know, the current body of research in this literature, is founded on a whole range of methodologies: individual and aggregated case studies, naturalistic observations, archival records, self-report surveys, field experiments, additional lab experiments. By 2010, this area had become so extensive that 5 colleagues and I were asked to review the literature in a white paper published for the American Psychology Law Society. At this point, I'd like to zoom in on an insight about the causes of false confessions. And I have to zero in on this because I never saw it coming. And it actually, making this point gets to another point I want to make about doing applied research. Specifically, I want to talk about what I have referred to as the phenomenology of innocence. Several years ago, I was working on a case involving what I thought was an innocent person who had confessed. And I spoke with him afterwards. He was exonerated, he was cleared. And I asked him, all right, after all the hours of interrogation and resistance and interrogation and resistance, what finally broke you? He had confessed eventually to something he didn't do. And at first, he gave me an answer and I couldn't quite wrap my head around his explanation. He said, I confessed because the detectives told me that they collected physical evidence from the crime scene and they were sending it off to the lab. He said he figured he would later be absolved. I said, wait a second. This was a paradox of reasoning that I could not have drawn from a theory. It took me a while to process. And in contrast to my sense that innocence is the great deterrent to a false confession, This man said he capitulated precisely because he was innocent. And he knew that it wouldn't matter. Ultimately, it'll work itself out. They'll figure out that I didn't do this. Well, innocence now can be the enemy of the innocent. This led me to another question. People always ask me, particularly when I give public lectures, well, don't we have our Miranda rights to silence and a lawyer, and doesn't that protect us? The answer is no. It was certainly the Miranda court's fantasy that that would work, but many people, especially kids, don't comprehend their rights, and more importantly, people who are innocent don't use them. Interested now and reconceptualizing innocence as a mental state, I started to ask exonerees, and I asked several of them, why don't you just get a lawyer? And each would shoot me this look, this puzzled look, like I asked the dumbest question. And they all said about the same thing in the same way. I didn't need a lawyer. I didn't do anything wrong. Believing in a just world, innocent suspects waive their rights. They believe they don't need to use those rights. And we now know this to be true. We brought it into the lab. We've seen it in field data. We now know this to be true as an empirical matter. That is a phenomenal realization, and it only came from talking to the exonerees. Well, let me move to one more point about the confessions literature as it exists today. And this is the second of the twin pillars that took me back to 1978. And to be honest, I don't know what's worse. What's worse, that police can get innocent people to confess, or the Heiderian fact that when it happens, everyone believes the confession? Here's what the problem is. People harbor these two myths, and both are detrimental to justice. One, I'd never confess to a crime I did not commit, and people use that belief as an anchor point for judging others. And two, I'd know a false confession if I saw one. Now, I've talked about the first. Research shows that the second is also wrong. You wouldn't know a false confession if you saw one. Common sense doesn't help, but now add this shocking empirical effect. And I want to point to 2 points in this slide. And it has to do with this. Almost all false confessions appear to be independently corroborated in 2 ways. First, and this is a statistic that I find perhaps the most troubling of anything. First, it turns out that most confessions contain narrative details and other credibility cues that all but ensure everybody will believe those confessions. Law professor Brandon Garrett analyzed 66 false confession cases from the Innocence Project, and he found that 62 of them, that's 94%, contained facts about the crime that were spot on accurate, and not known to the public. But they were known to police. Through a process of contamination, whether it's leading questions, suggestive questions, simply communicating the information, crime scene photos, a visit to the crime scene, whatever it is, those details insert themselves into the body of false confessions. Second, my graduate student and I, Sarah Appleby, content analyzed a sample of false confessions, and we found not only do they contain accurate details, they contain other credibility cues that make it impossible to disbelieve the statement. They don't just contain a statement of this is who, what, when, and where, but this is why. This was my motivation. This was my reflections on my own mental state. These false confessions contain apologies. They contain expressions of remorse. There is no way a judge, a jury, or anyone else can see past these Hollywood-like statements of confession. And so there is, in all of this, metrics of internal corroboration. The confession seems self-corroborating. It's not just an admission of guilt, it's details, it's a chronology, it's a narrative, and it's spot on accurate. Second reason people believe false confessions is that there is another troubling statistic. 78%, I got these data again from the Innocence Project, 78% of known false confessions were later reinforced by a jailhouse snitch, an eyewitness, or forensic tests that all, quote unquote, corroborated the confession. In fact, these other errors of evidence were corrupted by the confession itself through what ETL drawer Jeff Kukuka and I have called forensic confirmation biases. What do I mean by that? Recent experiments have shown that when a confession is known to an eyewitness, it causes that eyewitness to change his or her identification decisions and to do so with confidence and identify the confessor. We found that confessions can lead lay people to perceive two unrelated handwritings as a match. It can lead polygraph examiners, professionals, to see deception in ambiguous polygraph charts. Even the interpretation of latent fingerprints and complex DNA mixtures can be biased by confessions and other contextual information. In other words, by the time an innocent confessor appears at trial, the jury is presented with this proverbial mountain of evidence. But that mountain of evidence is nothing more than a house of cards built on the back of a false confession. The net effect is that the innocent defendant is stigmatized both before and, as research now shows, after exoneration. Now, I'm going to bypass my recommendations for reform and invite anybody interested to email me for reprints, because I want to use the balance of my time to make a more general point, meta considerations about applying psychological science. And in particular, what I want to do is advocate for two things. One, working in the trenches, and two, talking to the public. There's no need to advocate for applied research. This is for a century now, psychologists have enmeshed themselves in applied research. But what does that mean? It doesn't just mean changing your subject matter, an applied subject matter in an applied venue. It means more than that, I think. When I lecture, and I'm hoping you're looking now at the slide of this poster that I have, I typically open with a PowerPoint slide. I call it my wall of faces. As you can see, it's a poster-sized copy. It hangs in my office. I have another copy in my lab. I update it periodically with new exonerees. And the wall presents this matrix of portrait photos, and I update it all the time. The pictures and the stories they tell are a varied lot. You can see there are men, there are women, black skin, brown and white, children, teens, fully formed adults, people from different ethnic backgrounds and countries. A quick glance would show you this is a group of people that are diverse. They have, in some ways, it looks like they have little in common. The one thing they all do have in common is they all confess to a crime they did not commit. The subliminal message I like about this slide is it shows you something. This can happen to anybody. And it doesn't take just a specific type of person to be vulnerable to committing a false confession. In many of these cases, and this is the point of the slide, most of these individuals I've spoken to. Even if I haven't worked on their cases, I studied their cases. I bring exonerees into my lab, and I bring them in to talk with me and my graduate students. The reason we do it is simple. They motivate us, they inspire us, they inform us. That idea about the phenomenology of innocence, that didn't come to me from any theory in psychology. There was no past research that led me to it. It was hearing the words of an exoneree who basically said, I confessed because I didn't do it. And then my examination with other exonerees, I've interviewed others, and then we brought it into the lab and tested it. So when you look at this slide, when you look at these photos, this poster, look, for example, at the second row, third from the left, black and white photo of was then a kid named Peter Riley. 1978, he had already confessed to a crime he did not commit. He confessed to killing his mother in Connecticut. Why did he do that? Because after hours of interrogation, detectives offered him a polygraph to clear himself, and he took it. And they misled him into believing that the polygraph showed deception. That was false. And it caused him not only to break down and confess, it caused him to become disoriented. It caused him to then imagine how he killed his own mother, which he did not do. He was ultimately exonerated. His conviction was overturned, but he internalized this belief. This happened in 1973. There wasn't yet a literature on false memories, but this is exactly what was happening to him. I learned from that. The notion of an internalized false confession was one that Larry Reitzman and I learned from the Peter Riley case. And then if you look at Jeffrey Deskovic, top row center, Westchester County exonerated. Again, he's one of those that when an article appeared in the New York Times, why did you confess to something you didn't do after all the hours of interrogation? He said, well, they told me they had DNA. I figured they would see I didn't do it. That was that phenomenology of innocence again. And then if you look at the bottom row, second from the left, her name is Kenzie Snyder. Kenzie Snyder confessed, but was never convicted, not once. She went to trial. She was an American college student in South Korea. She was acquitted. That verdict was appealed. She was acquitted again. Appealed again. This time it went to the South Korea Supreme Court, and she was acquitted a third time. At no point was she ever convicted, much less wrongfully convicted. Well, 18 years later, she still feels the stigma attached. The stigma of a false confession does not detach itself upon acquittal, sometimes upon exoneration. We only learn these insights by talking to the exonerees, and that's why it's so important. I bring them into my lab, they meet my students ask questions, and we get research ideas. We have produced research as a result of the reports of the exonerees and their experiences. And then finally, turn to my next and almost last slide. My second point of advocacy is this. We, the psychological scientists of APS, we really should communicate our findings to the public. I didn't always think this way. Influencing policy from the top down, that's one way to instigate reform. Another is to make change by creating a groundswell from the bottom up. With the New York State legislature considering a bill that would prohibit police from lying to suspects about evidence, which is permitted all over this country. In most other countries, it is not. I wrote this recent op-ed piece, and I wrote it in order to help influence that legislation. This is an important means of influence that we should exercise. You know, there are other ways too for us to take a bottoms-up approach. Public lectures, books, expert testimony, working with podcast and documentary filmmakers, trained in a pure science model. Not everyone is comfortable with doing this. I know I wasn't until the Central Park jogger case came along. That was not the way I went. But you know, you might argue that it's short-sighted. I know I now argue that it is awfully short-sighted to spend years getting funded, designing experiments, publishing in our journals, only then to stop short of serving as a spokesperson when it matters most. Because this is what I've learned. If we don't speak up, that void will be filled by others less informed. And with that, I'd like to turn to my final slide and acknowledge too many people that I won't even mention in speech, because you can see it here. From my mentors to my former students, to the exonerees, to my friends and colleagues who I've learned from over the years, and to my family members, all of whom are absolutely indispensable to the work I do. And with that, I say thank you, and thank you to APS for this award.